Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, podcast where mental health professionals talk about their own mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the show, head over to Patreon, drop down in the show notes. We got merch, we got all sorts of stuff. So appreciate all the likes and follows, reviews, etc. Super excited. I have another author on today. I love getting my professionals who are maybe mental health adjacent, not mental health professionals, but swim in the same waters that I do as far as being a human being with mental wellness challenges. And so another author today, I'm joined by Mark Green, whose new book is Round We Dance, and it's about ritual and how to do ritual if you're unfamiliar and how that's beneficial. Super stoked to have you on. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
This is the third book you've written, Mark. You're a prolific author at this point.
I still can hardly believe it. I just got my author copies of this book a couple of days ago, and the feeling of holding the new book in my hand, and it's actually a physical book, and it's got beautiful cover art and all that is really a great feeling. I still kind of find it hard to believe that I'm a person who writes books, but yeah, this is the third one.
Yeah. In the foreword to the book, you give a little bit of your history, and one of the things you write about is being in the pagan spaces in the United States for decades. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about that in your own personal life, and then obviously getting into some of what the book talks about, which is ritual. So do you mind kind of giving a Cliff Notes version of your introduction to paganism and kind of how you got in this space to be able to write a book?
Sure, not at all. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story because I was raised in a scientific household, a very dysfunctional, abusive scientific household, but a scientific household nonetheless. So the whole topic of religion and God never even came up. It wasn't that we self-defined as atheists so much as that all of that was just kind of irrelevant to life experience. And so I emerged into adulthood as an atheist. And in my mid-20s, early to mid-20s, a friend of mine invited me to an autumnal equinox ritual that his pagan coven was holding. And I still, to this day, don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I knew there was something missing. But I went, and I had this very mixed experience. On the one hand, it was very awkward for me, standing in a circle, holding hands and talking to invisible presences and drumming and dancing and all this stuff. But on the other hand, it was really intriguing because it occurred to me, I'm a lifelong environmentalist, really passionate about nature and about the ecological world. And I wouldn't have noticed that it was the autumnal equinox. It struck me that if I was really connected with the cycles of nature, I would know what time of year it was, and I would be paying attention to those things. I'd be paying attention to the cycles of the moon, and I'd know what phase the moon was in at any given time. So I went to another thing, and then I went to another thing, and then I went to Starhawk's spiral dance ritual, the great big spiral dance in San Francisco. And long story short, 35 years later, or 25 years later anyway, I was a leader in the community. I led rituals. I was part of a long-time ritual circle that's still going called Dark Sun, which has been around since 1991. And just a lot of wonderful experiences, really moving, transformative, wisdom-fostering, growth-encouraging experiences in the ritual and pagan world over time. So yeah, it's been a real augmentation to my life in many ways, even though I'm still an atheist, still don't believe in disembodied intelligences and all that magic and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I love in the book, as someone who's coming to paganism and ritual from a much different background and perspective, like I love how you start with like, yo, it's awkward and like That's okay. And that sounds very much like it's based on your own experience of that like initial, this is weird, but also good, I guess, and trying it again and getting more comfortable with it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I wrote this book specifically for folks that are having that kind of experience where, we've got this huge wave of the so-called nuns, people that are self-identifying as no particular religion, many of whom are atheists and agnostics, but many of whom are just people for whom the institutional religions don't work, either because of their values or their behavior or their authoritarianism, whatever those things are. But they're still looking for something, right?
Yeah.
They want community to plug into. They want values to celebrate with their kids. They want a cycle of holidays. And this book was really written to help people create that stuff for themselves, without having to plug into any of those institutional traditions.
Yeah. And I mean, we can be some armchair cultural analysts here. Like, what's your experience being in the pagan community for so long of this rise of the nuns, of people seeking out something like naturalistic paganism, who are looking for connection and meaning making and structure, but don't want the organized religion attached to it?
It's an interesting thing because, it's a little bit of a long story, but to compress it as much as I can, when I came into the pagan community in the late 80s, we didn't really talk about theology. We didn't talk about what we believed. It was kind of understood that we all believed different things, but that was okay. We were all pagans and we held hands and we celebrated our rituals together. And in the late 90s, about 10 years later, a big wave of newcomers came into the American pagan community. And they were mostly refugees from evangelical Christianity and Catholicism and Mormonism. The more kind of authoritarian Christian flavors.
Yep.
And they brought their frameworks with them. They weren't going to believe in that stuff anymore, but they still thought that faith was really important. They thought that belief was a requirement in order to have a religion. And they started really kind of throwing their elbows around, to be honest, about how you can't be a real pagan if you're not a capital B believer in these disembodied powers.
Sure.
And part of what that did was it forced those of us that didn't believe that way to become visible and put our hands up and say, wait a minute, we've been doing this for a long time and we're here too. And so in the early 2000s, that's when naturalistic paganism first emerged, which was called then humanistic paganism. It's when folks like Anya Orga and John Cleland Host and John Halstead started writing about non-theist paganism. And there was a big sort of conflict for a while, mostly online, because that's where you do conflict, right?
Right.
About, well, are those real pagans or are those not real pagans, blah, blah, blah. Well, in the long run, it turned out there's no authority. It's not like we have a pope. They can't decide, who's a pagan and who's not. There's still people out there who think that non-theist pagans aren't pagans, but I've been practicing for 37 years now, and I think I qualify.
Yeah.
So that's kind of been my journey through this. What happened to me was I got to a point in about 2005 where I had some experiences in the pagan community where really unethical, inappropriate behavior was justified as the will of the gods.
Sure.
And I said, I'm out. No, I'm not affiliating myself with this. You're going to use your imaginary friends to justify really shitty, wrong behavior, and I'm not about it.
Yeah.
So I left and let my altar gather dust and all that good kind of stuff. And within 6 months, I was really miserable.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the community gatherings. I missed celebrating the Wheel of the Year. I missed my community. I missed the rituals. I missed all that stuff. And that got me started thinking, well, how can I have all that stuff without having to subscribe to things that I don't find credible to believe in? And that's what slowly started the ball rolling towards my writing first an essay and then a book about atheopaganism.
Yeah.
And that's what brings me here today.
Yeah, and that's how you and I connected in the first place. I found the Atheopagan podcast, The Wonder, that you and Yucca host, and then the Facebook group, and then started dipping my toes into some of the Zoom mixers. And at the time, during the pandemic, nothing was open. I mean, so everybody, I think, was desperately seeking community. I had left the church and was trying to figure out like where that community might land for me. And so I don't know, I think I'm the target audience for the new book, because that these people and then the group of the nuns, right? Like the millennials and under that age range is my group, people who were raised in religion and have left it. So I do think you sent me a copy so I could review it for our chat today. But like, there are things about words like ritual, words like spirituality that, like, for somebody who's coming out of a high control religion, kind of raise your hackles.
Mm-hmm.
But these are not things that religion owns. These are things that religion used because the human psyche responds to these things naturally. It's how we're wired. And so I like that kind of an explainer on like, hey, this is how to do ritual. Like, ritual doesn't need to be an organized religion. It can just be a thing for you and your friends, for the passage of time, for life transitions. Like, then what do we do? How do we actually do those things?
Right.
So
yeah,
I think there's an audience here, like those nuns and those naturalistic. There's so many naturalistic wilds. There was the wild church. Like, there's all these groups that I think are looking for this type of thing, and introducing someone who's been in the pagan spaces for a long time, introducing ritual, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, well, that was what I thought too, because one of the things that I've seen as the atheopagan community has evolved is that we've attracted a lot of people from both the pagan side and the atheist side.
Yeah.
And they have things to teach one another. The folks on the pagan side could really learn about critical thinking and Occam's razor and the scientific method. People on the atheist side are at sea when it comes to rituals. They don't know how it's done. The modern pagan community in the world since the 1950s, 40s, when modern neo-paganism was invented, they've got a lot of experience in what works ritually and why, that we've accumulated over the time that I've been, partly over the time that I've been involved. And so cross-pollinating those things has been an interesting approach in my mind. And this book is definitely for folks who they know they want something, and they know what it isn't, but they're not quite sure what it is. And I think I hope that it's helpful to folks that are in that situation.
Well, and I think, coming out of like, I was raised Christian, high control, conservative Christianity. I think there's a lot that's there as far as ritual goes, but we're devoid of the meaning. Like, you do it because it's tradition more than because it's meaningful. And so I like the book kind of laying out, like, here's how you can do this. Here's how you can make your own. Here's how you can get into it. Here's some options. Like, take it and make it your own, which I think is new for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's a little bewildering for some of them. It presents them with the blank page problem. Yeah, okay, I'm free. I can do whatever I want to do, but what should I do? So I go through a step-by-step process in the book that lets people kind of start with their emotional idea and flavor and theme, and then sort of crystallize that down into an actual ritual. One of the slogans that I often say is that the problem, when people talk about religion being a bad thing, I don't think the problem is religion. I think the problem is religion with crappy values.
Yeah. Or
And
toxic.
unfortunately, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say we talk about toxic theology in the religious trauma world. Like religion
Mhm.
itself isn't bad, but if your religion is teaching something bad, that can be problematic. And I would say like what you talked about earlier with some of the fundamentalist thinking, like power structures that lack accountability also historically have been a problem for organized religion.
Yes. And I should say, to be fair, that the pagan community has not escaped that. There have been traditions that have been created in paganism where certain people have lacked accountability, and the structures that they've created have been designed to prevent them from being held accountable for their behavior. And there have been problems. There have been sexual abuse problems and harassment problems. There have been financial shenanigans of many, many kinds. And so when I was envisioning atheopaganism, really my rule of thumb for all of it was, what if we did it all right? What if we, what if we weren't authoritarian? What if everybody was accountable? What if everybody was equal and it was truly egalitarian and there wasn't like an elite clergy class? What if we were transparent about our finances? What if we embraced consent as a model for how we interact with one another? All of those pieces. And I wouldn't say we're doing it perfectly because nobody does anything perfectly, but that's the vision that we're pursuing. And I'm pretty amazed at the incredible people like yourself who have come into this community and helped make it real. Just stellar, phenomenal people.
Yeah,
That it's really
what's
my pleasure to be friends with.
I think the Facebook group is around 5,000 members, and
Yeah.
the Wonder does well. As far as podcasts go, again, like that's how I stumbled across it. And again, I think we can talk about problems in organized religion that paganism hasn't escaped. I would say, like, as a newer atheist, leaving religion 5-6 years ago, like some of the history of new atheism in the early 2000s and some of those big figures who had problematic issues later, like,
Mhm.
again, it's a human psyche thing. Like organized groups are tough because they're in-group, out-group dynamics that are hardwired into our brain. To have a group that's aware of those things and actively working against them is how we safeguard it. Ignoring that that's a problem just leads to the problem being propagated.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, I, I think there's a lot that can be said for what the new atheists, the so-called four horsemen, did for atheism in terms of elevating its profile and making it a legitimate stance. But that said, you've got four high status white guys with letters after their names who are accustomed to being thought of as very smart and really like to be thought of as very smart.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an ego issue there. And I think they did something good for us, and now I want them to shut up. uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Well, and again, like I think when we start getting into the history of organized religion, dogma, when things become dogmatic, when it becomes fundamentalists, like you're not a true believer or you're not a true version of a thing unless you do X, Y, or Z, or you've read this book or you've seen this speaker, like any of that stuff starts to get problematic because then we're starting to dictate for other people's lives what should be meaningful for them.
right, right. And that's something that dovetails better with neo-paganism than it does with many of those more controlling religions, because paganism tends to be very inclusive and tolerant overall. Very large contingent of the LGBTQ community, for example, lots of trans folks, um, uh, less presence of BIPOC folks, and that's an ongoing challenge that the community works with, because where it started was all about celebrating European traditions,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't, that's not everybody's legacy, right? Or
Right.
ancestry. That's not where we all come from. So But I would say that there is this tendency in paganism to celebrate, hey, look at you, you're a unique individual. You be that. Go be you as a unique individual. Whereas in, say, evangelical Christianity, it's like, here is a square hole. We are going to pound you into this square hole until you become square yourself. It's just a very different approach.
Yeah.
And for all of its foibles, I think that that's something that really speaks well to the modern pagan community, by and large. I mean, there's that whole racist Norse paganism contingent, which is only a part of the Norse pagan movement as a whole, let me say, which is problematic. But it's something we struggle with, right? It's something we work on.
Yeah. Well, and paganism, I think, is so hard to define because of being inclusive. Casting a wide net means it means different things to different people, and there is no authority, which is a good thing. But that also means the semantics and the words can get muddy because they mean different things to different people. And different, like celebrating different heritage, drawing different practices without appropriating. Again, like trying to, I think, land in a space that feels genuine and authentic to people is important, and it can seem intimidating, which is why, again, like I like the book and the idea behind the book, because I think it's very gentle. It's not prescriptive, but it's structured enough to say, hey, if this is new for you, here's how you can go about it.
Thank you.
And again, like I think your lived experience is really clutch, because it is weird. Like for me, I'll talk about my own experience as an ex-evangelical, like conservative, like super conservative upbringing. Like, I don't want to do ritual. Like, there's a part of my brain that's like, yuck, that's religion. I don't want to do that. And then there's a part of me that's like, really hard to get out of that, thinking about other people or feeling awkward. I can't carry a tune. I'm supposed to chant. I'm not real on beat, and so there's all this stuff that like gets in your head as far as like there's a right or proper way to do it. And I think I like the book kind of writes about, you write about like leaning into some of that, letting it be messy, and like that's part of your experience, so experience it. And that's how we talk about it in mental health too. Like, we're humans, our human experience is messy. Like, let's lean into some of the things going on in your brain and figure out what that feels like, and like hold some space for it and try and learn something, and then we can respond, then we can do something healthy. And so in the book you talk about like, learn some songs, get comfortable singing those, get comfortable drumming a certain beat. Like, you don't need to be an expert, but like there's some ways to get your competency up. But again, it's not you have to drum at your ritual or else. It's, if you want to do this and it's awkward, here's some options. And I think that's very realistic to like what a lot of people are going to experience as they start to do some of these things, as people move back into in real life meetups instead of just virtual. I think that's going to be really helpful for some of the learning curve.
Well, I certainly hope so. And that was the intention behind writing the book. I mean, my first book, which is called Atheopaganism, an Earth Honoring Path Rooted in Science, is a little bit more of a theory book. It's about my journey through all this discovery and all the research I did about religiosity in the brain and, neurotransmitters and, all that kind of stuff, to arrive at a conclusion that, unlike what the new atheists were saying, religiosity is something that's deeply human. And we are not just these rational actors. And, the idea that being right is what will make you happy, that may work for a bunch of, high status academics, but it doesn't work for everybody, right?
Right.
And the goal is happiness and wisdom and kindness. If we can live our lives that way, the world gets to be better and we get to be happier people. So when I think about the theory book, one of the pieces of feedback that I got about that book is that even though it lays out a theoretical structure for something called atheopaganism in the second part of the book, it's really not a how-to.
Right.
It kind of assumes that you've got all of this ritual background and stuff that you don't necessarily have. And this book was the needed companion, because this is the one where, if you read Sasha Sagan's book, For Small Creatures Such as We, which was a big bestseller and so forth, you might have some ideas about how to, about ritual being important and, some examples, but you've still got that blank page problem, right? It's like, I want to do a ritual that improves my level of confidence in seeking a job, for example.
Mm-hmm.
What do I do? Well, this book helps you with that. It helps you to work through the process of what you do.
Yeah. And leaves it's structured enough to give you outlines, but not prescriptive, so that you can get creative with it, which I think is really where like a lot of the meaning making comes from, is like, what's meaningful to you. Mark's writing the book, this might be meaningful to him, but if you're not a white male, something else might be meaningful to you. Or if you're not of European descent, or if you grew up pagan, that might be one thing. If you grew up atheist, that might be another thing. If you're coming from Mormonism or XJW or ex-evangelical, like those are all different things that you might bring something meaningful to you, or you might want to avoid.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I have found repeatedly in the atheopagan community is that one of the rituals that folks that are refugees from other religious traditions really seek after is a way to try to put that down, a ritual way to try to really, kind of purge themselves of the legacy of that, so that they can be free to move forward in a spirituality that makes sense to themselves. And this book will tell you how to do that. It won't say do this, do this, do this, do this. It'll say, here's how you build rituals that are meaningful for you. You plug in your meaning, and we'll go through a process, and you'll get a picture of, do you need to hold a funeral for that? Do you need to burn something in a fire, or disperse it into water, or there's lots of different ways.
Well, and humans, again, we're wired for this stuff. How many students upon graduation from high school or college or whatever burn their books? How many, people burn up their wedding vows after they get divorced, or burn up their wedding certificate? Like, there are all these ways in which, like, our brains creatively are trying to embody the emotion we're feeling. And that's really what ritual is. I think just, again, like, this idea that it belongs to religion has gotten in the way of a lot of people coming up with creative rituals for our everyday life and for these seasonal or life transitional stages of being an adult, getting married, getting divorced, like a loss or grief. Like, I talk a lot about grief in therapy with people. We don't have a cultural grieving process as an American. Like, funerals on Friday, back to work on Monday. Like, that's not healthy. And there's no sort of cultural support around what that feels like. And so it's this weird space where historically there would be some ritual involved in that. And in other cultures, there still is ritual involved in that. And we just don't have that anymore. And so I think the book does that well too, of like, I know it's in the first book, Atheopaganism, like the Wheel of the Year, super helpful, especially as a refugee from another religion, to not have to celebrate religious holidays, but still have something to look forward to and celebrate. But then, something like death, or a divorce, like 65% of Americans who get married get divorced. Like, that's not a small percentage of the population.
Right.
And having some way to mark that and to celebrate that and to create space for it and hold space for it. Like, those are trendy words in our modern times, hold space, but like, how do you actually do it? And again, like, I love the book. I think it's so helpful for somebody who's coming to it and seems overwhelmed. It can be, like you said, blank page problem, or like analysis paralysis. There's so many options. How do you pick one?
Yeah. And thank you. And one of the things that really strikes me as I wrote this book and kind of thinking big picture about wanting to foster a movement, right? Wanting to make change in the world by emulating different ways of living, is that it is really a crime that we don't teach children these skills. Because Christianity's domination has made it that all the rituals are witchcraft and you can't do them because that's offensive to God somehow. But learning how to do ritual behavior that helps you to moderate your emotions, to process your emotions, to change your psychological state and mood, that's a very basic sort of emotional Swiss Army knife that every kid should learn how to wield. And it's really problematic to me that that's not the case. And we see that in adults all the time. It's like, you never learned to deal with your mood, and now you're spreading it around to everybody.
Yeah. Well, and a basic example I use often is the ritual around bedtime. Like, so many adults have poor sleep hygiene. When we're kids, we brush our teeth, we maybe take a bath, we read some stories, we snuggle, and then we go to sleep. And like, we just stop doing that at some point, and then expect like, oh, I'm laying down so my body knows to go to sleep. And like, it doesn't. Your body doesn't know that. Your brain can't just make that happen. All of that extra work that we do for children to teach them to rest still works for adults. We just stop doing it at some point. But like, that's ritual. That's training that's getting your brain and your body communicating to each other so that you can have an experience that your body is experiencing, not just your brain's thinking about it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. The amount of ritualized behavior that we have in our lives is really pretty staggering when you actually start to look at it. Mm-hmm. And I differentiate between ritualized behavior and routines. Because brushing your teeth by itself, yes, that's a routine, but it doesn't have meaning behind it necessarily, except as you suggest, we're going to bed now, right?
Yeah.
But, we've got, people who wear their lucky underwear and, all the, people, crossing your fingers and all the many, many, many ritualized behaviors that we have in our lives. And we don't pay that much attention to it. I don't remember the name of the anthropologist, but someone suggested that humans should be thought of as the ritual making creatures, even more so than language. That truly what we do is we make meaning through ritual. And I think that really turning around and taking a good hard look at that and really understanding it and then really getting versant in the skill set that helps us to do that is a part of our birthright as humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the word skill set there because it's a thing you can get better at. It's a thing you can get more comfortable with. It's a thing that is open-ended enough that you can make it your own. And if you are uncomfortable, like, there's options. There are things we can do to practice that and get better at that. And I think, so much of it is I talk about the brain and the body connecting. Like, I will say my experience of Christianity, there's a huge disconnection of your body. Your body's bad, so you're not supposed to connect to it. It's not trustworthy. Right. And so ritual in like my conservative Christian upbringing was not about an embodied experience. It was not, you didn't feel it in the body. I was in a mega church. We went to a small, dull, pipe organ only music type church where nobody was getting up and celebrating. Nobody was feeling the spirit or speaking in tongues. And so like, again, this idea of like connecting to your body for some people is uncomfortable. For a lot of our modern society, we don't connect to our bodies. And so that's where regulating your nervous system can come in. That's why there's drumming or chanting. Those are things that get your brain and your body connected in a way that doesn't involve your intellect mucking it all up, but just letting your brain and body do what they know how to do already. And so like that helps regulate your system. Chanting chant at a soccer game or a football game regulates the crowd. Everyone in the crowd, their system gets regulated. And like, we just don't experience that a ton, I don't think. Sports are a good example of ritual because so many athletes are superstitious, but so are the fans. You put on your jersey and you make your, preferred appetizers and you do a whole thing. Like, that's ritual. That's what that is.
Yeah, for sure. And those aspects of it tend to be the things that folks who come in from the atheist side are most uncomfortable with, because they're used to living in intellect and having it all be about what you think. And what I find is that there's a phrase I came up with a few years ago that I really like, which is suspension of disbelief. We talk about going into a theater or a movie or something like that and suspending our belief for a while, so that we can experience the entertainment. Well, suspension of disbelief is stopping with that nattering voice that says, this is stupid, you shouldn't be doing this, this doesn't make any sense. Settling into a brain state that allows you the freedom to do those behaviors that take you to a different place. And that really is what ritual is about in many ways. I feel that as people get better at it, they're just more comfortable in their own skin, and I'm a heady guy. I live in my head a lot. I wouldn't say I've got the greatest relationship with my body either, but I understand how important that is. And there's another piece beyond that, which is that to the degree we embrace physicality, the fact of our bodies, all of it, the breathing, the eating, the drinking, the shitting, all of it, that turns us towards the material as sacred and valuable, which naturally leads to a sense of the earth as something to be revered, the physical universe as something that's sacred and brings us joy, puts every breath in our lungs, puts every mouth of food in our mouths. And so there's a natural continuity between the development of that ritual practice and the moving into a more embodied experience, and a real sense of ownership and belonging and place in the universe and responsibility to live in ways that are in accordance with its health.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about other things our modern society misses, like the aging process.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to stay young forever, a ritual and a connection to your body for the aging process not being bad or wrong or whatever, but like that it's a natural course and there's wonder and there's, lowercase m magic in that process. And it's good. It's or at least it's neutral. It doesn't necessarily have value until we ascribe value to it. And so I think it's one of those things that, like, yes, these are spaces where we're like, oh, society doesn't treat the elder with a lot of respect. And it's like, well, there's no way to do that. We don't respect aging because we don't practice aging. We're trying to stay young all the time or live forever, instead of leaning in and experiencing it and having an outlet for that experience that isn't just you work until you die.
Right. Yeah. And part of that, I mean, this goes to my critique of capitalism and all this kind of stuff. The whole idea, I mean, it's all tied together, right? It really is. Right. When you start thinking outside the box of the frameworks that Christianity has put around modern Western culture, you really start questioning a lot of stuff. And, to me, part of the deal with aging is that you accept that there are trade-offs. And capitalism tells you can have everything if you can pay for it. But the reality is, I mean, we talk about youth being wasted on the young. Yeah, you've got this great, hale, healthy, pain-free body that can do all this stuff. Many of us, not all of us, of course. But you're not necessarily very wise about what you do with that body, right? Because you don't have enough lived experience to have become wise yet. As we get older, things start to hurt, things start to break down, but hopefully we've accumulated some wisdom that's a trade-off for that. And so we're able to find more joy in stuff that isn't quite so extreme in behavior, and to build happiness in the people around us and in our communities and families. Now, to me, that's a worthy deal. I think that's a perfectly acceptable framing for what life is. And, it's okay. I'm 62 years old. I am giving up some things that I had when I was younger. And it's an ongoing struggle with that, because I'm still constantly being told by the overculture that I need to try to pretend to be young until I die. But I'm trying to get used to the idea that, okay, this time in life has some particular trade-offs, and I value a lot of the things that I have arrived at through the process of living. And those are the payoff, right? Yes, things hurt, and I'm not pretty anymore like I was when I was young. All that kind of stuff. I'm more invisible in social spaces because our culture ignores older people. But on the whole, would I trade it for being 25 again? I would not. I wouldn't. I think it's okay. Yeah. And this brings me actually to another big piece, which is the embrace of the fact of death. Recognizing and really accepting that we're mortal and that this is a one-way trip and it's all that we get is a central tenet of atheopaganism and of naturalistic paganism in general. And I think it does a lot of good things for us. It sounds very scary for people who are accustomed to resisting even talking about death. But I feel like my life is given so much meaning and so much urgency by the fact that it's not going to last forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing that, like, working in religious trauma, that is hard to explain when someone's first coming out of religion, because it is scary. Like, if you've been raised or you've believed in some version of the afterlife, it's very comforting because death is scary because it's unknown. But getting to that point where, like, oh, I feel much more connected and alive and aware of my life, not being concerned about an afterlife, just having right now, helps be in the present moment so much more. Like, there's so much good to it, and it's easy to just kind of summarize that for someone and be like, oh yeah, I forgot how scary that was initially. But, like, yeah, that's one that, for me, that process was really easy, and for some of my clients it's not been so easy. But, like, letting go of either eternal punishment or eternal reward and just living for your life was so, like, freeing, and just feels much more authentic, I guess. It seems so much more grounded for how I want to live my life. And I think that allows for a lot more meaning making for people.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And part of that meaning making is in, because if this is it, then how we conduct ourselves and the moments that we make become very important. And one of the things about rituals is that they are the creation of special moments, right? So much of our lives, we have routines, we go to work every day. It's easy not to remember exactly what last Tuesday was like. But if last Tuesday had some kind of a ritual action in it that was unique, you will remember that. And I have confidence that, presuming that I don't have dementia, that when I'm on my deathbed, I will be able to look back at many, many, many very special moments in my life, many of which I created or co-created with other people. And I think that's a way of adding a lot of spice and seasoning to the ride.
Yeah. And I mean, even with dementia, just the psychologist in me wants to say, like, those are the things that still tend to survive our brain deteriorating.
Mm, mm.
Those older events, those events that we have a lot of meaning around, are the things that stick with us more than just our straight up memory power of remembering things. Like, meaning making and ritual helps us remember them more. They get stored in a deeper part of our brain. And so those are the things that tend to be significant and stick with us.
Good point. Good point. Yeah. Yeah. So, um, a part of what all of this adds up to is a sense of life as an adventure. And, you know, it's looking at the outside from my life. I mean, I work in the nonprofit sector. I work for an environmental organization, which is very meaningful work for me. But it's still like I get up in the morning and I go to work. I work at home
Mhm.
remotely, so my commute is 2 feet long. Um, but in fact, I'm in my office right now. Um, but um, so looking from the outside, you might think, well, this guy's having just sort of an ordinary pedestrian life, living in a rental townhouse in suburbia, and there's nothing particularly unique about it. But to me, I feel like I have deep friendships, deep loving relationships. I have community with people that I really admire and value. I have my intellectual life, which expresses itself in books and in blog posts and in podcasts and all that kind of stuff. I feel like I'm really living.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people want. They want to feel they're really living. They don't want to feel like it's slipping away or they've lost their chance. And nobody's really lost their chance. You might have to make some changes that might make people around you uncomfortable, but nobody's really lost their chance to live a life that really feels full.
Yeah. 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 And this, I think it's one of those, I mean, the pandemic changed a lot of things, and I don't think it was a good thing, but silver lining, like, I do think people are looking at meaning making and looking for that richness, looking for that intentionality. Young folks, millennials and under, and older folks too, but certainly there's a generation of awareness that capitalism doesn't work. So what else are we going to
Mm-hmm.
do? And like
Yeah.
looking for this meaning making, I think is yeah, it's so needed. I see it so much from the mental health field, obviously, working with the clients that I work with, but also I love connecting with authors and poets and people who work in creative spaces writing about the same thing, because it's needed. Like, we're all seeing it from these different avenues, from these different walks of lives, that having a rich, intentionally lived life is what people are looking for.
Yeah, for sure. And I should say, because this is a mental health podcast, I mean, I've had my own journey with relation to mental health. I've had major depressive disorder since I was 7, and refused to consider the possibility of medication until I was in my late 40s, early 50s. But I've now been in remission for 12 years with a
Yeah.
good antidepressant cocktail. And in that time, I've written 3 books and helped build a community and all those kinds of things. So, I understand the struggle
Yeah.
that people can have. I've spent months at a time in bed, unable to do anything because of depression, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Not that I have any, but if I did,
Yeah.
um,
Well, but I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think some of the black and white thinking that permeates culture is like, oh, well, if I have a meaningful life and I have good support, I don't have any problems. And that's not the pitch. Again, I think it's different from organized religion in that it's not saying do these things and your life will be awesome.
yeah,
It's saying these things help life be good. These things help life feel full. But we're not trying to avoid pain. We're not trying to avoid it. We're just trying to cultivate joy. We're trying to be intentional to make sure we have good stuff for all the inevitable bad stuff that happens in a life. Like, you're going to have loss, you're going to have grief. Those things are normal.
Yeah.
What do we do with them? How do we kind of get through that? So I love the joy in the book, though. Like, the title's Round We Dance. The podcast you have is The Wonder. Like, I think just that, like, joy, and like, we can be depressed, we can have anxiety, we can go through breakups, we can have issues, and we can still work to find that joy, that magic in our lives, that wonder of existing. And like,
Yeah.
I think that's a theme, especially when I'm working with people who are struggling with their mental health. Like, that's so hard to grasp sometimes. And so it's wonderful to have outlets and have places where you can find that.
Yes. And it's a learned skill. I mean, you have to train yourself, especially because humans are hardwired to look for problems.
Right.
You know, on the savannah, it's like if you didn't notice that there was a rustling in the grass, you might have been the one that got eaten by a lion. So paranoia tended to get built in. We're always looking for a problem to solve, right?
Right.
So training ourselves to look for a flower to admire and smell, and a sunset to stop and watch, you know, to to give those things an equal footing as much as possible with the problems is a learned skill. It's about learning to focus your attention, and it makes all the difference in my experience in how to live a life.
Yeah. Well, Mark, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat. If people want to pick up the book, if people want to learn, find your other books or follow you online, where do they go? How can they find your work?
Sure. Well, this book is called Round We Dance, Creating Meaning Through Seasonal Rituals, and you can order it at any bookstore. It's out from Llewellyn on April 8th, but pre-orders are open on the Llewellyn book site website. My other books are Atheopaganism, an earth-honoring path rooted in science, which you can also order from any bookstore. It's out from Ingram Spark. And then A Red Kiss, which is a collection of poetry from the past 30 years or so, which also includes a section of poems for the Wheel of the Year holidays. So really any bookstore there, you just have to know my name, Mark Alexander Green, and go and look. Our podcast is The Wonder, Science-Based Paganism. And you can find that anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify or whatever that is. My blog is at atheopaganism.org, and I write there. And then there's the Atheopagan Society YouTube channel, and there's a lot of stuff, Facebook group, all that kind of thing. But if you're looking for my stuff specifically, those are the places to look.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll do a shameless plug, because Atheopaganism, the community, has been very helpful as I left religion and deconstructing and getting through the pandemic. So I'll plug it for you. We did a web weaving, which is an online conference. There's in-person meetup that's planned every 2 years. So like, lots of great stuff for people who are looking for meaning making around these things, or looking to connect. Like, there's community, and making those connections, I think, are really helpful.
I should jump in.
Go ahead.
You reminded me. We're doing an in-person gathering over Labor Day weekend this year in Colorado Springs at the La Forêt Retreat Center. We did one of these 2 years ago, and it was just a magical weekend. It was just really amazing. Wonderful people, great rituals, great food. Everything was just fantastic. So I encourage you, if you're interested in meeting other people of like mind and exploring this, come on and join us. We'd love to see you. All the registration information is available at the Atheopagan Society website, which is our nonprofit, and that website is theapsociety.org.
Yeah, and we'll have show notes. We'll have all these links in our show notes. I'm speaking at the in-person conference, so I'll plug that as it gets closer. But yeah, and again, connecting with ritual, connecting with other people through ritual. Like, again, I think the desire and the growth for people who want to do this stuff in person is certainly kicking back up. And so, yeah, Mark, thanks so much again for taking the time. Really appreciate the book. We'll have all the links for people to find it.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really had a good time. Thanks, Jeremy.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.